Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, minus a tooth, and today's conversant is Lisa Selin Davis, who is an author featured oftenly on the New York Times and other papers of note in New York City and beyond. A couple years ago, or a few years ago, actually, in 2017, she wrote an article that was trying to bring nuance to the conversation around gender and transition. And she received one of those precious pile-ons that are so oftenly distributed in our culture on certain issues. She then embarked on a quest to write an entire book about the categories of man, woman, and especially the tomboy. She has a book out now called Tomboy, and in this conversation we talk about the book Tomboy, the category tomboy, and we also talk about her perspective on the direction that certain elite institutions, specifically journalist institutions, are taking now with regards to certain issues. She's neither red-pilled nor blue-pilled, and I am aware that there are a certain contingent within my audience who kind of judge people based on their political affiliation or to what degree they have taken a stand for or against the elite institutions and the way that they are operating. I think Lisa is trying to find her way in this domain. She also has a Substack that you can subscribe to, and her Substack and her book will be linked in the description. Without further ado, here is Lisa Selin Davis. You teach music, or do you just arrange musical instruments around yourself for comfort?
I just want to look cool.
Oh.
No, I live in an apartment, so there's one room that's like the office, the instruments, the crap. So this is the everything. This is the everything room.
The miscellaneous.
But yes, I do play those things. Not this thing. I play the other things a little bit.
Like live with like a little jamboree band? Or?
No, but I think in pre-pandemic days we would, sing harmony and strum things. Mm-hmm.
Thank God for that pandemic. We don't have to listen to human flourishing anymore. It's all contained in apartments.
Yeah. Now we just watch TV.
Or make
That's
TV.
The pandemic. Or make TV. Yeah, that's right. Make things for people to watch.
Yeah.
Also try to, as I'm trying to do, as we can talk about, I just feel like a lot of people have agendas. Some people want to ban things one way, and some people want to control how people think. And I just want to diversify the media narrative. So that is why I am talking to you.
Okay.
And I don't have, I have my own feelings. But I also feel like my job is to recognize my feelings and my biases, but that shouldn't affect how I report about something, or rather it should be incorporated into how I report it. So I'm just like very, very concerned about this dominant narrative that all of these institutions have come to accept and have replicated this kind of, affirming without question that has become how the medical and mental health communities also approach gender dysphoria or anything related to kids who identify as trans. And I just think the media followed suit, and I think there's a story about that. And I also think there are hundreds of stories that they're not covering. So I feel like pretty much obsessed with this now, and it's kind of all I can think about, and I can't even do my work because I just think about this.
Okay.
I talk about this.
So at one point you didn't think about this.
And I watch TV. At one point I didn't think about this. Well, we can talk about that like whenever we're, going live, or unless you're going to put this in, live, whatever, unless we're, which is that when I wrote my book, I had experienced like what it was like to be canceled And I should also talk about what it means to be a freelancer, because I have no institutional support. So I had been sort of canceled for something I wrote that was very mild, with a didactic headline, which is a recurring problem, that I write these nuanced op-eds and then the Times or the Washington Post slaps on these didactic headlines. Many people don't read the op-eds, or the headlines change the way they read them. And I had no idea what this culture war was when I wrote my original op-ed in 2017 for the Times. I was making a cultural observation from personal experience. And at any rate, I experienced what it was like to be canceled, to have people threaten me and threaten my child. And I hadn't gone through that before. I had written hundreds of articles, but no one that had never come up. And after that, I actually met with some of the people who worked pretty hard to cancel me, including Chase Strangio, who at that time would talk to me. We met in the financial district, and we had coffee for an hour and a half. And then I tried to write about that. I tried to write about these people told me I got it wrong. And I went to talk to them, and I went to talk to Kate Bornstein, who is not like Chase Strangio, who is a real thinker and a complicated person and a Buddhist, and is willing to consider multiple perspectives, I think. But I met with lots of people to try to understand their point of view, which I think is important. And then I set out to write this book. And honestly, the way I wanted to write the book was so that I would have the support of the trans community. I thought, how could I talk about gender nonconformity, the biology of it, the psychology of it, the history of it, and what's happening to it in this current climate, without making what I had been trained to think then were these vulnerable people more vulnerable? How can I add to the conversation without subtracting to what they're saying? So in order to do that, I had to edge out a lot of information, and I had to not question their narrative.
What do you mean edge out?
I mean, I had to not look carefully at the research around gender affirming care. And I really didn't know about the research about desistance of, kids who are gender nonconforming or have gender dysphoria from a young age, not these, adolescent that we're seeing now with all these comorbidities. And I didn't know about distinguishing between these groups. I was really focused on, how do you tell the difference between these trans kids, as if I understood what trans kids were, and a kid like mine or other kinds of gender nonconforming kids? And I called up Diane Aronsaf, and I called up all these people to talk to them about that. It was also very important to me to not alienate those people, and to feel like, I have lots of queer people in my family. I'm not the straightest person anyway myself. And, I probably have a queer child. So I don't want to be a hater, and I wanted to understand. I wanted to understand more. So I had a lot of interesting conversations with people, and I rolled them into this book, which was, mostly ignored, the book. And the Times didn't give me, so they did give me one op-ed in February. My book was supposed to come out in May of 2020. So in February, I wrote an op-ed for the Times, and I was kind of testing, how would my message go? And it was about tomboys in the media. And I was saying, hey, we've got all these trans kids in the media, good for them. But what about masculine girls? What if we put those back? And I wanted to see how it would fly. And indeed, Jennifer Finney Boylan gave it the thumbs up. And then the whole community on Twitter gave it the thumbs up. And I thought, oh, this is how it works. One prominent person tells everyone else how they should feel. That's really instructive for me. But I don't think even so, I don't think I internalized how serious this is in terms of media narratives. So anyway, just in the past 6 months have learned so much more, tried to share what I learned. Nope, not happening. Shut down. So that's what I want to talk about.
There's something
but I
about
I probably have to say all that other stuff first,
We're just gonna have a conversation.
Yeah. A conversation.
Yeah. What is there was something that you were describing that seems like a sea change in how I guess the kind of basic premise that there's a good faith dialogue going on a number of different levels with regards to these different cultural groups. And in some time over the last decade, probably in the latter half, it went from we're going to try to stand up. Everybody's going to try to represent these marginalized communities and understand them better and give them more support and be on their side. And at least within certain domains of the very online or the very activist trans narrative and other groups, it changed where it was no longer about an exchange of ideas. It was about the domination of a point of view. And it seems like you kind of watched that happen to you without really seeing it happen across the culture, maybe? Or how did you have to reformulate your activity as somebody who's a thinker, who's a journalist, who's trying to make sense out of the culture and then add sense to the culture?
I've tried to understand what has happened to the media. And I think it's several things. The first is Trump, which really forced the media to kind of take sides, be more didactic, point out when someone is lying, and they went from, softly intimating that something was wrong to saying like, oh, this is a lie, and Trump really forced people to take sides who, might have been able to see things from multiple points of view before. I think we're all experiencing a kind of sickness or aftershock from Trump that he was the death of nuance, in the media. But I think a couple of other things happened at the same time. I mean, I think we had a generation of journalists who then believed that their job was to report in a way that protected marginalized people. And I think we haven't really thought about what it means to be on the margins. Is there a reason you're on the margins? Are your ideas good? Are you really vulnerable just because there are fewer of you? There are a lot of important questions to ask about groups that are not in the majority. And do we want to make decisions that are worse for the majority of people, but they benefit a small group? These are all questions worth asking and certainly worth debating in the media. So I think we got journalists who felt their job was social justice and not finding the truth or the many truths, because there are always competing truths, especially when you're talking about gender. And then I think you had Jesse Singal's piece in The Atlantic and the backlash to that. And I experienced that on some level. I can't remember if Jesse's piece was before my Times op-ed or not, but they weren't that far apart from each other. And the objection was so intense that I think to Jesse's piece and to mine, that I think it forced, I'm actually thinking Jesse's was after mine. It forced people in positions of power to ask, what have we gotten wrong here? If the backlash is this severe, we must be doing it wrong. But what's interesting is I think the Times would not take my op-ed today. And the reason I say that is that I've sent many similarly nuanced things, questioning the meaning of the word gender, how we're teaching about gender in schools, always asking questions, never being didactic, always being respectful, but saying, we need to talk about this in a more complex way. And they really haven't been taking them. The Washington Post recently took one. But I think what I wrote in 2017, which was about having a daughter who was performing the gender role of the opposite sex, and people constantly trying to facilitate her social transition, which was confusing to me because, most girls looked like that when I was a kid, or many, and she was doing things that feminists worked so hard for girls to be able to do. So it was confusing. Why would you think that would make you a boy when you're doing this thing that was once illegal for girls, Like you play baseball. Well, girls could only play Little League since 1972, I think, around Title IX. So so I was writing about that, but the Times, it caused all this controversy and backlash, which, again, I hadn't experienced. And the Times kept promoting it and putting it up, and I was just ready. I was mortified. I was mortified of being called a transphobe. I would never have thought of myself that way. I stated very clearly I'm supportive of trans kids. Again, I don't think I knew what that meant, but I didn't think it was my kid. And I said in the piece, like, I'll support her if she wants to transition. Again, I didn't know much about what that meant, but I was not being transphobic. I was asking questions about gender stereotypes and identity and adult assumptions about children. But I think that has really changed. And so rather than reveling in the backlash and promoting it as the Times did after that piece, I just think it's been shut down. It's just been shut down. And if we're going to question this at all, it's only going to come from trans people, and no one else can say anything about this. And we're barely going to question it. We're going to be supportive. I think there are a lot of reasons why that is, but I think that kind of online bullying is part of it.
It doesn't seem sustainable for the paper of record, or what was once the paper of record, at least that was their tagline, it seems short-sighted that they wouldn't be running toward questions and running towards facilitating, a back and forth rather than just the forth and no back. Do you know why they've decided on that tact?
I don't know why. I know that they've turned down some really, really important op-eds from people who believe deeply in gender-affirming care, from adult trans people. I can't say too much about it, but I've seen some of these pieces that they've turned down that would really, really open the conversation, a conversation we need to have, and they have turned them down.
Oh, are you saying articles that question gender-affirming care, or just complete gender-affirming care, or that are you for it, and that those arguments would then spark up some sort of conversation?
I'm saying that there is a dominant narrative about trans kids that the media is promoting. It is a narrative that I bought without asking much about it. And that narrative is that these are the most vulnerable children, and that if you don't affirm them exactly, without questioning them or giving them therapy to explore the causes of their dysphoria, that they will kill themselves. And the narrative is also that gender dysphoria equals trans equals medical transition. And we are, in many of these groups like the ACLU or GLSEN, have media guidelines for how you should report about this. And I find that troubling, though. I think that other nonprofits also have that. But, I think we in the media should be concerned about that. Don't tell us how to report. Let us report the full story. And I really didn't understand the difference between these different populations. So there's the population, who comes out between 3 and 6, who may be insisting, I'm in the wrong body, I'm in the wrong category, maybe they're dysphoric. These are the kids that these days, many are socially transitioned, but that is not really what this, Dutch protocol is, because the Dutch protocol was watchful waiting, but that's what we brought over here. Now, a lot of people socially transition them. And they are very feminine males and very masculine females. And most people aren't worried about that population because if they transition, they probably won't regret it. They probably feel pretty comfortable. I mean, I think we should question, we in the media and all humans should ask, what the medicine does to them and what does it mean to suppress your natural puberty and go through an artificial puberty, and the effects on bone density and brain development and fertility, and is your uterus going to fall out in 5 years? It's worth asking all those questions. Mm-hmm. And the media just reports things like medical experts, say this stuff is safe, and they don't all say that. So we should always be reporting these multiple points of view. But I think this group that some people call rapid onset gender dysphoria, and a lot of the clinicians who've worked with trans kids for years don't want to use that term because it's politicized. But they'll tell you, yeah, we used to see some teenage kids, but not very many. And we only saw males. We hardly ever saw a teenage girl. And and maybe this group, maybe these people aren't good candidates for this Dutch protocol. Maybe they need a different kind or a deeper assessment. Or if we haven't been watching them for years and years, like we have the other ones, maybe we need a different protocol or different kinds of testing. And they're presenting with, other mental health problems. They're presenting with eating disorders. They're presenting with depression. They're present their high rates of autism. They're very gifted. It's the group you've heard about. Mm-hmm. An interesting group. And there's been this shift within the medical and mental health community to say we should treat the gender dysphoria and it's going to fix all the other stuff, presenting medical transition as a panacea. Clearly, that's not working for everyone because we have these detransitioners. We don't know how many there are. We should be reporting on them. We should just be reporting on them. But quite shockingly, I was told for a very major media outlet not to use the word detransition. And I was told that because Jack Turbin says it makes trans people more vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And that was the end for me of just, I can't stay silent anymore. This is wrong. We can't have activists telling us how to report and suppressing stories. So this medical transition may be working for the great bulk of people. But if it's not working for some and these people are being really, really harmed and traumatized by it, then we should report that. And then we should all be having a national discussion about it to make sure that people who would benefit from it get it and people who will be harmed by it don't. We did that with the vaccines when 6 people got sick from the Johnson & Johnson vaccines. Out of millions, we paused, we did more research. Mm-hmm. And I was just talking to my friend this morning about the CDC guidelines for, dealing with COVID and how some people get mad that they're constantly evolving. But that means that the science is evolving and they're listening to the science. And that's a good sign that the guidelines are being revised because, they took in more information and they changed their minds. And he called it a developing story. And that's what this should be. This story should be a developing story that changes as we get more information and not just the repeating of mantras by activists. I mean, we need to diversify the media narrative. It's our duty. It's our duty in this business.
To get a tiny bit meta, this is just something I've been trying to figure out lately. You dropped the word, it's been politicized. And then we were talking about the gender issue. Then you brought up the COVID issue. They're both very politicized. I think that's just something that I've heard a lot, but I haven't heard anybody really define what they mean by that. And if there is anything that has to do with community that's not inherently politicized, or what does that mean? And when something does get politicized, how do we control that? How do we, turn it up, turn it down, understand what it is? Would you mind tackling that for me?
So one thing that's happened in the media is that you'll see now articles that call something or someone racist or transphobic, making this kind of value judgment. And I'm sure lots of other names too, but I've homed in on those. And for instance, there was an article in The Nation about Quillette. I don't read Quillette, but I know that they have a more diverse media narrative around this issue of trans kids. And I don't know how diverse. Hopefully it takes into account that trans people are real and that many people are happy they transitioned. And we should never forget that when we're talking about this stuff. But I saw this article in The Nation calling Quillette transphobic. And I thought, well, Quillette's trying to let other people speak, as you should at The Nation. You're saying that writing about, these rapid onset kids is transphobic. But actually, we should all be doing that. We should all be asking, what's the difference between these populations? Some clinicians who've worked with these people for years don't agree with what's happening. Let's talk to them. And let's talk to, if you have to, these kind of activists, academics and doctors who are, if you have to. But make sure you talk to people who have another point of view. And most of the people who have the other point of view, this urging caution, urging us to look carefully at the research, most of those people are left wing. They are not right wing. So this idea that objecting to the media narrative about trans kids or wanting to cover the battles around gender affirming care in a more complex way, that's being cast as right wing. And in this country, the bans are coming from the right wing. So it's really, really easy for people to think, this is Republican versus Democrat, right versus left, conservative versus progressive. Mm-hmm. But in other countries that are taking a second look at gender affirming care, it's coming from within the medical and mental health community itself, who are saying, we've got regretters, we've got people who know a lot about this and who've worked for a long time with these kids, saying we're seeing a population that we really haven't seen before and we don't have research about them, right? In other countries, it's not politicized, but here this is presented as a right-left issue. And that is what is preventing the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, all of these places from being able to do a thorough and complicated job reporting on it, because they'll be accused of being right-wing. Does that make sense?
Would it be fair to even broaden that and say that our culture and our media apparatus has become so polarized that it can't handle anything of note without it being political? Could it be that we are in a state now where everything is about interests that are secondary to the topic at hand?
And everything is about identity, and identity is so complex. I mean, I can't believe we're acting like this is a super simple thing. Are you left? Are you right? Are you trans? Are you cis? Are you gay? Are you straight? How do you know? Your identity evolves and changes over time and depends on who you're comparing yourself to. but we're all being asked to declare a side. And again, I bring it back to Trump. I think it forced us all to declare a side. I think whatever polarization was dormant in our society became activated then. And I am politically homeless now, and I am, and I'm homeless in the media. And I definitely, I started a Substack to try to tell not the truth, a truth or multiple truths, and I tried to explain to some people I worked for what was happening. And they accused me of being biased, which is ironic, really, if you think about it, because what I'm saying is I want to look at all these multiple points of view. And they're saying we have to stick to this one point of view. I'm not saying I'm less biased. I'm saying I'm aware of my biases. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying that...
Or you're wrestling with them, or you're engaged with them actively rather than just assuming that you're not and that these biases are right, which is a bias.
Yeah. I'm well aware that, as an atheist who grew up very strict Orthodox atheist, my parents belonged to the Freedom from Religion Society.
Okay. What is the dress code for that, or the rituals that you guys do with the Orthodox atheism? Do you guys jump on a Bible every third Wednesday or something like that?
It involved at first, as a very young child, being very interested in church. And very interested in Christians, because I also knew somehow that I was Jewish, but I didn't know what that was. But I knew it made me different. And I knew that the Christian kids waited on the lawn for my lawn for the bus, and I had to walk to school. I had a lot of thoughts about it. I knew that they were different, and I knew that we saw the world in a different way. And as I grew up, I understood that my life was going to be constantly impacted by religious beliefs, that my kids can't go to school. School didn't start till September 13th because of all the Jewish holidays, because people believe in what I think of as myths and fairy tales. And also, I can't park in front of these churches. If you're in New York City, it's a big deal, because I think there's a practical reason, but it has to do with the fact that the people inside believe in myths and fairy tales that I don't subscribe to. I'm sorry to call them fairy tales. I should call them supernatural beliefs that I don't believe in. I don't share, but I have to live here with them. I have to put my hand on the Bible if I go to court, I think. So I think I grew up in a way that forced me to understand that people believed fundamentally different things than I believed, and that there was value in not necessarily respecting those beliefs, but maybe just figuring out how to peacefully coexist. And we're certainly not doing that with a kind of somewhat religious belief about gender identity, which privileges feeling over fact, or subjective experience over objective.
Mind over body, in the very least.
Biological categories. And I'm not saying that that's not valid, or that we shouldn't consider that it's not real for some people, but it's not real for me. That's not my experience. So I think we have stopped asking, how do we accommodate multiple belief systems? And we're just trying to shut people up who don't agree with ours. I think that's the ACLU has gone from, representing the KKK to saying we should ban books, right?
Did you see what they did with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's quote? They quoted her speaking about female rights to bear a child and that the government shouldn't be involved in that. And they replaced every mention of gender with they and them and people with brackets around it. They're literally rewriting.
Yeah, and they shouldn't rewrite it, because they shouldn't rewrite Ruth Bader Ginsburg's words. And if they want to also add something about not everyone, it doesn't work for everyone, but it certainly doesn't work for me to be, I don't want to be a person with a uterus, but I'm not necessarily saying everyone has to agree with me, but I am saying that my beliefs and viewpoints should also be taken into account. And we don't just solve for one group because it's a smaller group and because we have a narrative about the group that is also not accurate. And there are so many amazing stories that I have pitched in the past few months. Just amazing stories about, the secret resistance of these people meeting and, all left-wing people. Again, let's depoliticize this. The objectors are lefties. I'm sure the right wing object to it too, but the lefties have to meet in secret because they don't feel safe talking. That's fascinating, right?
Wait,
that's
in what context
story.
Are these little cabals going on?
There are like parents and therapists and people
with
who
regards to gender, then.
Yes, with gender identity ideology and wanting to speak out, but they have to have pseudonyms or they're coming up with, strategies. What an amazing story. No one took it. You had, Jamie Shoup on. I've been talking to, I think he's calling himself him now. He also doesn't care. He doesn't care what pronouns you use. Jamie's story, as you know, is fascinating. I pitch that all over the place. We should talk about autogynephilia. Maybe you don't believe in it, but you know what? I've talked to many people for whom it's incredibly helpful. Blanchard's research is helpful. Ken Zucker's research is helpful. Let's not suppress the research. You might not like what it says, but what you'll see in the media is instead of like, oh, here's this interesting research that we can also consider, which contradicts something else, you see articles about why we should be ignoring this research. And these articles are repeating the op-eds of people like Jack Turbin. I'm not interested in making an enemy of him.
He mistook me for puberty and blocked me, so I don't have much.
What a joke. But I'm curious about him. I tried to interview him for a story and I've never had anyone treat me that way. I told him I was very confused about the research, which every journalist should be confused right now. If we take this in, our reaction should be, wow, this is a big mess and I'm confused. And he, it was very startling to be treated like that, kind of yelled at and bullied and told why I should believe differently. The story got taken away from me anyway because I had explained, how complicated this situation was. And then anyway, I've lost a lot of work as I've kind of come out. And again, I'm not coming out against anything. I'm just trying to diversify the media narrative. But a lot of these articles that are saying, here's why we should not listen to any of this research are repeating talking points from op-eds that the New York Times has published and CNN published.
So they're doing that idea laundering then again.
Yeah.
They've imported that from academia and now they're doing it in journalism.
And they're not actually calling up the people who did the research. Call those people up and ask, okay, people are saying we shouldn't listen to your research. Why do you think we should? And this is something I feel journalists should really be doing, is making more phone calls. I've really tried to make it a practice in the past couple of years. If I'm going to write something about someone, if I'm going to critique someone, I like to call them up and say, this is what I think. And inevitably, I see things in a whole new way. And when I've seen people write things about me, not even like my points, but me, because they don't want to deal with my points. No, they're not, they don't know me. They're getting stuff wrong. Why didn't they call me up and have a conversation? I'll do it. I met with people who worked hard to cancel me. So I find it all deeply distressing. And I really don't know how to rectify it, because when I try to explain it to people I really like and trust and want to work with, I just got taken off these stories. And in fact, mostly don't have work, but I have a book I'm working on, so I'm okay for now. But I think I'm too small to cancel is what I've realized.
That's my excuse too. So, speaking of your work, then when did Tomboy come out? Your book that was in 2020.
It came out
in March.
August 2020.
August.
Yeah.
Okay. How does the category of tomboy as a category of a gender, if we talk about gender, we're talking about these stereotypes and these categories and stuff, and they're socially constructed, yada, yada, yada. They have to do with patterns of behavior. How does tomboy operate? How does it work? How does that category possibly protect young girls to be themselves without intervention or bullying of either stripe?
It was it's a word that's problematic because it means, Tom is male type and boy is boy. So it's a double masculine for a girl, and people don't like the word. And I'm not one of those people who's, wants to object to language, because I think that's a smokescreen for making real lasting structural and cultural change. So I don't have a problem with the word, because the word provided space for girls to diverge from what was expected of them in a way that adults understood and didn't pathologize, as long as they were pre-pubertal, right? So that category could catch a very feminine girl who just liked sports, which still are mostly associated with boys, but of course not entirely. And it could catch an extremely masculine girl who was likely pre-queer in some way, though not necessarily, right? I mean, not every super masculine girl grows up to be a lesbian or trans, but a lot of them do. And by the way, I don't think, when I wrote my book and I interviewed dozens of people and they all had the exact same origin story, I hardly tell the difference between these stories. They were so similar. And then they had wildly different adulthoods. And I think it's very difficult to predict what identifying with or performing the gender role of the opposite sex means about who you're going to be. The degree of tomboyness probably has something to do with later queerness, but not necessarily. Not necessarily. And does it mean you're a butch lesbian, or does it mean you're trans? Well, that seemed to have to do with age. That is, for the butch lesbians I interviewed, they were too old to have had the technology to transition, and they had quite a bit of gender dysphoria at puberty and in young adulthood, and got over it when they kind of discovered butchness, that there was a category for them. We need these categories. They soothe us. That's how the mind works. It categorizes everything into safe or unsafe, or yes, this is something you can eat, this is poisonous. This person is a potential partner, this person isn't, this person is dangerous. It makes sense that we need these categories. But this was a big, broad category, and I called it a protective bubble of ambiguity. And that bubble bursts at puberty for most kids, in which they're expected to feminize, or there's pressure to declare a different category, maybe. And my argument is, we made room for this trans category, but I still don't think we have made room for genuinely gender nonconforming people for whom it is not about identity. Well, who are these people who, from a very young age, these girls who are acting, like boys, and most of that is a cultural construction, but not all of it. I mean, the blue stuff and the kinds of toys and the clothes, all made up. But there are some behaviors, that are seen much more in males than females, and they're probably it makes sense because everything is divided for reproduction. So it makes sense that there might be some behaviors that are connected to what your job is going to be later to propagate the human species. But most of it's made up. So what does it what does it mean when a kid is in this one biological category but drawn to the other? My argument has been it's really hard to know. I think social transition is people do it because they're told that their kids are going to kill themselves if they don't, and because it soothes the children, right? Because that category doesn't fit them and they want to be in the other category. I don't think they think much about the long-term implications of that. And I think...
such as what? What are some of the long-term implications, especially the ones that are overlooked? Okay, we don't even know.
I mean, I think you're probably... there's some speculation that it's more likely to increase your gender dysphoria at puberty when you're, definitely not going to be in the category that you've been living in. But I don't think we have enough good data on that. And I think if you're doing that kind of psychological intervention, maybe it's good to do it with some oversight, or, with some questioning, or to make sure your child understands biological reality too, and that you really understand what we know and don't know about the medicine that your child will likely get at puberty. So but again, I'm not saying do it, I'm not saying to do it or not to do it. I'm saying let's report on the complexity of it. And, but I think it erases some of the lovely ambiguity of the category, that this category that could accommodate these super masculine girls.
Yeah.
And now they're being facilitated into another category. And I just want to say something about the categories. Again, that sometimes this category really doesn't work for these kids. And I get that. And when you look at some other cultures, I've been looking a lot lately at the Fa'afafine of Samoa. And the Fa'afafine are often referred to as like transgender, or as a way of saying, look, other cultures have their genders, the same with the Hijra of India. But these are actually feminine gay men. And putting them in a new category does a tremendous amount of work and really protects them. It allows traditional men to not be threatened by them, preserves their manhood. In a society where homosexuality is not accepted, by saying they're not really men in the same way, allows them to not be persecuted. It allows straight men to sleep with them, which, according to the research I've done, a lot of them do. And I think it suits people. Like, oh, I know what that is, right? Oh, that's a Fa'afafine. That's fine. No big deal. There's no gender dysphoria. There's no gender identity. And there's no medicine. Mm-hmm. So maybe we need to look to those cultures, not to say what we're doing is right, but to try to emulate that. Maybe we do need a category for these genuinely gender nonconforming children that allows them to be that without anyone telling them that they need to make any changes in their names, in their bodies, maybe in their pronouns. Like, what if they're just fine as they are, but they're different? They're legit different than the other people in their category. Maybe we can learn from some of those other countries. Maybe we need other categories. I don't know.
Compare and contrast that to the power of the category of the trans kid. You said that you accepted that. It sounds like you have.
I mean.
Doubted.
Oh, sorry, I'm an interrupter. I mean, no. In a way that I think is good. My ideas are evolving all the time. And again, when I started this, and the very first thing I wrote, I was saying, I support trans kids. I thought I knew what a trans kid was. And I had a good friend who'd written a book about trans youth years before we were all talking about this. And she had a foster daughter who was trans. And I was I had met some people who were very comfortable not being in either category, that like they didn't want bottom surgery. They had breasts, they took hormones, and they accepted themselves as something else. And that was where they wanted to be. And I thought that was interesting and informative. That's not the narrative anymore. So I thought I knew what it was. And the more I've researched, the more I don't know, because I don't think there's any difference between these gender nonconforming people I'm talking about and these young trans kids, the ones who socially transition before puberty. I think they're all the same. And I don't know how you tell. I guess you're telling by the degree of distress. But I think they are proto-queer kids. And once upon a time, we would have been like, oh, that kid's going to be gay. And now we are but we can't think of children as having a sexuality because we're Puritans still. So, now we don't look at it. Now we have this narrative that gender and sexuality are separate. And so when we look at a masculine girl or a feminine boy, we don't think, oh, that kid will probably be gay. We think, oh, it's about gender. It's not about sexuality. That's a trans kid or a non-binary kid. And I think, again, that those categories bring relief, psychological relief. They do a lot of work. Yeah,
they do. But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily beneficial in the way that they work out. Because the category still has a philosophical underpinning that in practice, if you just for sake of argument, let's invent the category of the trans kid and put that on a 5-year-old gender nonconforming kid, a male, then because they are trans now, we then socially transition them, then we block the puberty, then we put them on a medical path, and then we transition them medically. Like the category of trans kid already has that medicalization embedded in that word trans, right? So there's already an assumption in that category, or there can be if it's not very carefully constructed and questioned.
Yeah, there's an assumption about what the gender nonconformity means and what you can forecast from that and who they're going to be later. I don't know how many socially transitioned kids medicalize. I don't know. I know there's Joanna Olsen Kennedy's, I think that's her name. She's the one doing this long-term study. And I know that, famously she has the study with the 13-year-old getting the mastectomy, though I will say I did hear, about a 12-year-old doing it and then regretting it by 13. I don't know. And that 12-year-old also might be in a different category. Again, I think for these lifelong gender nonconformers, they might be perfectly happy transitioning forever because they've already lived in that category. And even the ones, I'm living in a world where we're almost out of gender nonconforming teenagers in terms of these lifelong ones, that the ones we know, the masculine girls we know who have always been that way, most have socially or medically transitioned, or that I know personally. So, but again, they might be happy and it might work for them. But these teenagers with no history of dysphoria or nonconformity are a different category. I'm not, what I'm saying is we don't know what it means to facilitate a child into a category that is largely associated with medicalization. We don't know. And therefore, we should be asking lots of questions. And the media should ask lots of questions. There's a lot of interesting questions to ask about that. And, I learned the word iatrogenic, which means like creating the disorder through the treatment. And that's what, that's the criticism from some people, that you're going to make gender dysphoria through social transition. And let's find out. But again, if we find out, if we did lots and lots of research and found out this is going great, these 11-year-olds who say that it's fine, I don't want children, they get the hormones and they grow up and it's 20 years later, 30 years later, and they're happy and their bodies are okay and they're fine that they, are infertile. Okay. But so far, we're seeing some research. We're seeing some people saying, I should never have been allowed to do this. You didn't evaluate me enough, and I'm not in the same category as those young people. I don't know about the young people. We have to listen to them. You can't just say, I don't like what you're telling me, so I'm not going to adjust my approach. I'm not just going to stay on this path and ignore the people saying, you've got to go over here now. And I think even the people who believe strongly that they can tell which of these young kids would benefit from medical transition and which can't, and who believe in gender affirming care, even a lot of them are very upset about this. And I want to say something I forgot to say about how I sort of pivoted so much from I'm supporting this narrative and not questioning it to I have to talk almost constantly about how bad this is in terms of media coverage. And that is that I started reporting for a major news outlet like pretty regularly about gender issues. And I was talking to, the nonprofits that are, very much supporting medicalizing children from a young age. And, I kind of felt like, I'm accepted in this world. And then I started interviewing clinicians and they would tell me something and then they'd say, can you turn off the recorder? And then they would tell me something else. Like, I'm going to tell you something off the record. And this was such a burden to me. I was like, what am I supposed to do with the fact that you just contradicted yourself? And I hope I won't alienate them now, but the reason they were doing that was because they wanted to keep their jobs, because they are people who believe in very, very, very careful assessment of the children. And if they speak out, they'll get booted and someone who blindly affirms will replace them. And so, again, how about that for a New York Times story? That's fascinating. That's so important. But instead, I was just stuck with, I got to write.
Well, the same forces that are putting them on the chopping block are putting the stories of them on the chopping block, right? The same cultural force.
Yeah. The same cultural force, which is saying there's one narrative, there's one approach to gender dysphoria, that these kids are so fragile that if you ask them questions about their gender dysphoria, they'll kill themselves. There's no evidence of this. And if it were true, we would have had piles of bodies because we've only been doing this for 14 years in this country. So where are the bodies from before? And we've always, 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 always had gender nonconforming people. And many of those people might have said, I was trapped in the wrong body. And they might have said that if they were attracted to someone of the same sex. Gender identity is a very recent concept. It's a concept by a largely discredited psychologist, John Money, who had some interesting ideas, but he's also really so hated by trans people. But his idea of gender identity is now taken as fact. And gender identity wasn't separated out from sex and sexuality until very recently. These things were all balled up together. So we can't look back on history and say, we can't look back at women who dressed as men in the Civil War and say they were trans, because women were oppressed and they couldn't fight in the Civil War unless they were men. They couldn't be doctors. They couldn't, there are so many reasons that a woman might take on a male identity. They couldn't even wear pants. And, when Louisa May Alcott said, I have the soul of a man, well, she was attracted to women. And there was no concept of lesbianism. So of course she would say that. And she acted like a man. She was a tomboy, That was the word we had. She wasn't interested in men or marriage, and she was tough and aggressive and brave. And would she identify as trans today? Maybe, but that category didn't exist. So this is another thing you'll see in the media all the time. You'll see trans kids have always existed, and anybody's from West Side Story was trans, and you're just like erasing the entire history of how women were treated and how sex, gender, and sexuality have been understood over decades and centuries and how they've evolved. It's so, anti-academic. It's so uncritical. It's acting as if the way you understand things now, that's how the understandings that have always existed. And it is not teaching people how to think, it's teaching people what to think. And that is not our job in the media.
Earlier, you brought up mention of this this guy's been heavily politicized, but it's kind of his fault. His name's Trump, and you put Trump not at fault or blame, but it sounded like you were talking about that as a phenomena, that whatever Trump did or how he behaved initiated or triggered something that had been dormant. It seems like things were in place to go in that direction, and they were just, rather than created by Trump, they were accelerated by the phenomena of Trump. I'm wondering, is there a way to roll that back, or will one person after another need to be forced out of the media establishment and do things, work this nuance magic outside of the mainstream until it gets back up and running?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm on here because I'm trying to diversify the media narrative, and I'm trying to wake people up about how we should report about this and how we should write about this. That is, I'm not telling you there's one way to do it. I'm asking everyone to really do their homework and to really talk to people who have competing perspectives. I think we're not going to get anywhere until the left media reports more honestly about this issue. That is what has to happen. And I think, interestingly, I think there's something similar with race that I don't want to get into because I don't know that much about it. I will say that the New York Times now has John McWhorter writing for them, although I think he really missed the mark on his latest piece, which I'm going to send him a note about, which he may or may not read. John McWhorter likes to interrupt this dominant paradigm on the left about race and to ask us to look more critically, more historically. And we either don't seem to have someone to do that on the left, or they're not allowed to speak. We certainly have plenty of trans people, you've talked to them, who want to complicate the narrative. We have people like Erin Kimberly, and I haven't talked to Scott Nugent, but I've talked to plenty of trans people who are, some of them are very glad they transitioned, but they want us to be honest about the realities of it and to ask questions about how do we know if it's safe and effective for children. And we have to give those people voices. And I think the other thing that happens besides Trump is the Own Voices movement. And that had happened really in fiction. I mean, I had a YA novel out a few years ago, and then kind of my agent was sort of like, well, I had all these great ideas, and she was like, well, you can't write about that, and you can't write about that, you can't write about that. And then I thought, so I can only write about like an atheist Jewish girl. I mean, what am I going to write about? And I gave up on that. And I think Own Voices is important, and it's important to have diversity of voices and viewpoints, but I think it turns into one voice. And I think not letting me speak because of how I identify, is problematic, because I am a subject matter expert, and I am not a hateful person, and I am not right wing. Although, as I said, I do feel pretty politically homeless at this point. In fact, being politically homeless should make me better at this job, and I think we're confused about what expertise is as we get more like we just have to let people tell their own stories and not interrupt it. And those stories are important, and there are places for those stories. But we also have people who take a broader view and analyze those stories and bring multiple and opposing stories together and try to synthesize them. Antithesis, thesis, synthesis. I believe in that. I believe in aiming for that anyway, or talking about not being able to arrive at synthesis. But I feel like we're just in antithesis right now. We're just like stuck in, we listen to all you people. Now you're going to listen to us, and you guys are going to do exactly what we say. It's an overcorrection. I understand it. I understand where it comes from. I understand people wanting to control how other people see them and talk about them. I would love to do that. Someone just wrote on Twitter that I should be fired. Literally they wrote, and I was like, well, I'm freelance and most of the is gone. So thank you. Would I love to control like how people see me and think about me and talk about me? Yes. At this point, I'm willing to put a lot on the line because I am so disturbed, and I am asking, where is our John McWhorter? And I have actually sent him a note saying, where is the John McWhorter? And I don't know if I can be that person. I think it's fascinating that if I identified as pansexual or queer, despite the fact that I am living an extremely, traditional heterosexual life, that would probably be enough. I could just say that. Oh yeah, I had a girlfriend. I did have a girlfriend in college. So if I wanted to call myself that, then I would have some cred maybe, and I'd be allowed, but I don't want to call myself that because I don't understand identity or identity politics. I don't.
You're not a believer.
I mean, I just think it takes me 45 minutes. If you ask me if I'm Jewish, it takes me 45 minutes to answer that question. I just think it's very, I think we're human, so we're tribal, and it totally makes sense that we want to announce what tribes we belong to, and the more people are in our tribes, the more power we have. And I would really like to have a tribe, and I don't feel like I have one. I feel like I'm not part of gender critical world, and I'm not part of blindly gender affirming world. I'm really just part of cognitive dissonance world where I'm trying to making me crazy. But I'm hoping, I think there are many people who are with me, I think, who are not, categorically on one side or another, but don't feel they can speak up. And their experiences aren't represented in the media anymore. So,
well, just to I don't want to burst your bubble or anything, but the media isn't just those guys. I'm the media now. You're the media now.
Right.
We're all the media now. So
yeah.
Those gatekeepers, and as they expend their authority by refusing to act on principle, rather to act on behalf of certain ideologies, they will only erode their own standing as the gatekeepers of knowledge. Maybe they'll get secure power by banding together with these the algorithmic platforms and stuff and reassert their hegemony. But for the time being, I see a lot more people putting a lot more trust in the individual journalist, the individual writer, the individual interviewer, podcaster, etc. than the big guys get the numbers still, but they're quickly losing trust.
Well, I've gone that way. I mean, here I am talking to you. You get, tens of thousands of people listen to you, and I've got my Substack that I've started, and where I'm delightfully allowed to say what I want to say, although not completely. I still force myself to consider points of view that are different than mine. It's a daily practice for me, and I find it very important because I
think that will bear fruit over time, especially as you build a relationship with your very own audience that have found you through one way or the other. They'll start understanding that you're constantly at work, working against your assumptions, and they will find strength in that.
But do you feel this is our only future then, is our individual voices? I mean, that someone can subscribe to the New York Times for the cost of, my Substack. Mm-hmm. So, it's like, I would rather just write for the New York Times. I would rather not be on my own, but I guess I'm asking, do you think my mission is this mission impossible? I mean,
the longevity of it?
I mean, my mission to diversify the media narrative. I mean, is the only way to get diverse viewpoints to go to individuals whose viewpoints you are already aware of? But isn't that just doing the same silo thing that created, contributed to, I don't want to just blame it on Trump, because I also think it's social media and the siloed experience of just getting your own viewpoint reinforced all the time, which I don't like that experience. Like, I try to check in on Fox News. I'm like, what are they doing over there? How are they presenting the world to their people? Mm-hmm. I don't want that from my media to just reinforce my worldview. So, yeah, what do you think? Do you think it's just you do your thing and I do my thing and we find our audience? Or is there hope for,
a unified collective front of storytelling?
Ununified, that kind of pluralism is valued in a media publication. Because in theory, that's what. Wait, I just looked up something on. I wonder if I can find this. Okay, the Times in its thing about why it's calling itself guest essays instead of op-eds, and it described the op-ed section as a welcome mat for ideas and arguments from many points on the political, social, and cultural spectrums from outside the walls of the Times to stimulate thought and provoke discussion of public problems. And they've turned down not just some very good op-eds from me, or guest essays as they're calling them now, but some vitally, vitally, vitally important op-eds. So I don't think they're doing that.
Yeah. No. There will always be aggregates that have more representation because they take a side and they take a point of view and they run with that. And that's the way that they shore up their funding and their audience, whether it be above them or below them. That will always be. There will always be these behemoths. But there will always be people who want something a little bit more complex, right? There'll be tons of people wanting Budweiser and Carlo Rossi. Very few people are going to want that Glenlivet or can't afford that. And by afford it, I just don't mean monetarily, but to take the time to really taste an issue. And when you pursue producing that content, you attract people to you, probably because of the topic, but if they like you, they might follow you to another topic, and then your way of dealing with information might start to inculcate that into others. So it's more humble than being, a New York Times staff columnist. It's more humble than that, but it's also more free. I think it's a little bit more exciting. I enjoy the freedom, and I don't necessarily want too much cred. I like being kind of grubby. Not to put down somebody like you that would deign to speak with me, but I like being a mom and pop shop. I think that's something to that.
But what do you mean? I'm too small to cancel. I'm happy to speak with you because I think that you're talking to the people who are the rest of the media won't talk to, and I think what you're doing is important. But I also want the mainstream media to talk to those people.
Yeah.
So, I've had several people tell me that this is ridiculous, my hope and dream. But I was also told, don't bother trying to be a writer. So I did that anyway. Mm-hmm. And I understand what you mean about it being exciting and that there's freedom in this. And I have so many things I want to say that I'm thrilled that I don't have to go through the pitching process and then wait around and and I'm taking the op-eds that the Times turned down or said, maybe, and then eventually they sent it to everyone and somebody said no. And I get to share those. But I do worry that it's more of the just people getting feedback of what they want to hear. I worry. And you asked, is there any way out of this? And that's why I feel like I'm talking to people, I'm talking to you, I'm doing my Substack because I'm trying to alert people that they should demand this of their own, of the media, of the conglomerates. But I wonder how effective we are when we're each doing our own thing. And again, it depends on what change you want to affect. What my idea of effective is the Times publishes this particular op-ed that I really wanted them to publish, not of mine. But if my goal is I'm just trying to get followers and make enough money to live on, which is very important, that's different. But I guess I have this. I'm very, very concerned about how we're teaching children about this subject and adults, how people are talking and thinking about it. And I'm really concerned about the politicization. Medicating children cannot be politicized, no more than, wearing masks and getting vaccines. We can't politicize science. It has to be above that. And this very same people who would say, listen to the science and get a shot are likely the same people who are saying, all this medication is safe and protect, trans kids because they're going to kill themselves, and probably haven't looked at the literature that says there's a higher rate of suicidal ideation, but there's never been a history of tons of, until quite recently there have.
Well, again, that's a byproduct of the team thinking that that we are enmeshed in. Where if you start to ascribe to one thing, let's say that you hate Trump, ergo this, that, and the other thing, right? And I'm sure if we have an alternate universe that we could peer into, and through this little window, Trump won in 2020, the same people, many people who are militantly pro-vax in our world would be militantly anti-vax. I'm sure that there's a crossover because a lot of people think in team terms, especially on complex topics, because every given person only has so much processing power, and can only stomach so much challenge to their beliefs. So they just kind of sign up to the R or the D or whatever it is. And I think that ultimately it's not the media's fault. It's not Trump's fault. It's our own fault for not expecting more of ourselves and, kind of leaning into the fast food of information and not, getting a taste for something.
I've thought about that a lot because I thought, like, I'm not a climate scientist, but I believe climate change is real. Why do I believe that? I mean, yes, there's no more winter, whatever. But I mean, it doesn't snow here anymore. But I know, I think that I believe that because I am a New York Times subscriber, right? And I trust that the people in there know what they're about, and I decide to believe that because I don't have the training to go through the data and look at it. And it's very similar, I think, with the research around trans kids. If people aren't looking at it, I didn't look at it carefully. It was really only when I had decided I wanted to write a book. This is not the contract I have, but it is what I hope I write next, about the history of how we decide what's normal when it comes to gender and sexuality, and who decides, and their own life experiences, and how that, and how that leaks out into society. And so I wanted to talk to Ken Zucker because I wanted to talk about gender identity disorder and gender dysphoria, and how these ideas of what's normal or pathological change. And that's when he said, "Oh, did you see my latest study on boys with gender dysphoria?" And 88% of them desisted and 2/3 were gay. And I said, "No, I didn't see that." And guess what? No one reported on it. No one reported on it, unless they reported on it to say why we shouldn't listen to it. And what's really, really interesting about the objections is that some of the objections are about Ken, who, by the way, his clinic was shut down. Then it was found that, all that misinformation about him. So now he has a very thriving private practice. But no one, when they talk about him in the media, they just say, discredited.
Yeah, that kook, that Canadian kook.
But he did operate from a place that it was worse to be transgender, not because he didn't like trans people, because it was harder on your body and harder in society. And it is a little easier in society now. I think it's still hard on your body. And that's a really interesting point, right? That starting with the premise that it's worse does affect the way you treat someone. What if we didn't think it was worse? If it was completely fine, and these categories of cis, if you accept that category, because many people object to it, but if you say, oh, it's fine to be cis, it's fine to be trans, no one way is better, then all of the kids would be socially transitioned who wanted to. We would treat them very differently if we weren't assuming one was harder than the other. But that's really interesting to me. And I'm trying to grapple with that idea, and I want to write about that idea. I want to write a whole book about that. But I think it's worth talking about that. But I also think what people are talking about when they think it's worse is they're talking about you're doing a very tough thing to your body, and changing your identity is a big deal. You're going to walk around the world. You're going to be treated really differently. It's all really, I guess I just go back to, there are so many amazing stories that are not being covered. Fascinating, deep, important stories that we're just ignoring. We got to cut that shit out.
Well, there's plenty of work to do. So even if you don't have a job, you can always participate in telling stories.
Yeah. I've been interviewing people. I spent months this summer because I pitched a story to the New York Times Magazine, which they turned down. I spent months interviewing people, and now I'm going to tell their stories on my Substack. I heard maybe the Times maybe the magazine is going to do something, maybe, and that's why they turned my story down. But we'll see. We'll find out. And what will it be? I don't know.
So you have this Substack that you're tossing immaculate content onto. You also mentioned that you have another book coming up. What's that? You want to pitch it to the audience?
That has nothing to do with this. It's called
Housewife. Is it about submarines? Oh, no. Okay.
Yeah, it's about submarines, yeah. No, it is about gender, and by gender I mean the norms and expectations associated with sex. It is not about gender identity in the least, but It's called Housewife, and it's about the history of the idea and ideal of the housewife and how it's affected private lives and public policy. And it's a little bit of a manifesto against the nuclear family, though I do love mine very much. But it deals with, interdependence and independence and shifting zeitgeist that put more and more pressure on women. And I think it's very interesting and relevant. And it comes, through the pandemic and what happened and creating a whole new generation of housewives who didn't expect to be housewives or didn't want to be. It is hard for me to work on it because I'm so invested in, I'm and obsessed with this other thing, but I'm very, very, very grateful that I have a book contract since, mysteriously when I started speaking out about this, a lot of my work dried up. No one said anything directly to me, though, I will say. I just got people stopped responding to me and turning me work. But I do have subscribers, and I have this very modest book contract. So I'm very, very grateful, and it will be interesting. And I hope that after I do this, I can return to this other idea about the construction of normal. And maybe by then we'll be allowed to talk about it.
Well, then you would no longer be a trendsetter. You would no longer be ahead of the curve.
It was my goal wasn't to be a trendsetter; it was to be a soothsayer, and to acknowledge all the competing sooths. Is that a word? But it used to be my superpower that I could that I was saying this thing that other people were thinking but too afraid to say. And it really, really became a liability.
Sorry, not sorry. I mean, it sucks that our society's here, but it's cool that you get to do this work. I mean, it's kind of cool, isn't it? Isn't it kind of cool to be kind of pushed out of the tower and then have to fend for yourself in the streets? No.
I think there are
not
different.
To make light of a serious.
I think there are.
Situation,
I think there are journalists who become journalists because they're like the gumshoe seeking whatever. I'm not saying they're not egomaniacs. And maybe this doesn't exist and we're all the same. But then I think there are the people like me who are writers. Like journalism is something I do, but I'm a writer and I write essays and I've written a couple novels and a lot of novels actually, but only 2 of them have been published. But I think most people write because they got an A+ on a paper in high school, and then they're spending the rest of their lives trying to recreate that. So for me, getting canceled, and also I'm mentally fragile and paranoid and whatever. So getting canceled was frightening, and it was the opposite of the point. Like I was like, I have a New York Times op-ed. You expect to be getting the cultural thumbs up, and then to be getting attacked was scary. But again, I was like, after a while, I thought, I'm going to read through the objections and see if I can understand them. But I feel like it's been 4 years and now I understand them less. I understand everything less than I did.
Is that why, is that what's fueling this obsession? This, you spoke about lovely ambiguity. Maybe is the ambiguity just swallowing you whole?
It's very difficult because when you talk about this and you're interrupting this narrative that people have been sold, you sound like a bigot and a hater because they've also been told that interrupting the narrative is bigoted. So I felt like nuance was my thing and people appreciated that thing. And now you end up with, as you were saying about the media, I mean, the way that Fox News, the reason it's so popular is because it's so didactic. And the only thing I'm didactic about is nuance. So I kind of feel like I strode over here to the middle with my like celebration of ambiguity And I'm like, oh, there's nobody here. There's no audience for this. You know, there's
Oh, ye of little faith.
and you know, and I have to make a living. So but I do think it's important that I give up on I think what I've done, I think the reason I'm talking to you today is that can't be about the A+ anymore. Now it's about something much bigger than that. Now it's about, we just have to do a better job. We have to do a better job covering this topic. And you can cancel me and hate me if you, I mean, I haven't been worth canceling so far, but, you know, that's difficult for me, and I would love some Xanax if it happens. But more people need to come to Nuance Land. More people got to get off from either side and come over here to the middle, where you and I are in our individual media productions.
I think that there's a lot more people than we realize because we're not centralized. We're a network. We're a decentralized network. And the more you spend, the more an audience member spends among them, and the more a content creator kind of lets go of their ambitions for, you know, the gray lady and embraces their situation and then starts dealing with them, the network just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. There's outliers. There's some people that we could speak about who are doing and are being rewarded very well for the work that they do out here.
One or two people who've objected to this narrative and I know are doing quite well. Mm-hmm. And you know, and hopefully those people will help me too. But I think we need to. I think what you're doing is shining light on those people, and I'm now kind of publicly one of those people. I cannot continue to support the narrative that we constructed and blindly affirmed in the media. I have to interrupt it.
Is there any gray date about this Housewives book? Do we know when it might be out?
Far in the future.
I think 10 years.
20.
Okay.
No. I think, what year is it? I think probably 2023 or late 2022.
Okay. So I can have you back on because this is, I really want to hear about this.
Oh, good. I'm so glad to hear that. I'm glad that seems interesting. I have to write it first, and then it has to be edited.
Yeah.
Just that little bit of stuff has to have
a little bit of work. Yeah.
But, and I have to pull myself away from this to do that. So I feel like maybe
and it's got you
interview,
in its bosom. It's just hugging you tight.
I think I feel like I was complicit in it, so I feel obligated. It has burdened me enormously, and I think the experience of having those people say something very different off the record and on the record really messed with my head, and I really didn't know what to do. I ended up calling up a lot of people, very successful journalists I know, and they all said pitch a story to the New York Times Magazine, so that's what I did. And now, you're willing to talk to me, so I'm talking to you. You know, I'm doing what you're talking about, which is, you know, carving a different path. And you have a big audience, and I hope they demand better coverage.
Do you have a final question for the record? Do you, well, I guess I'll ask you off the record if you have any recordings of you playing banjo, but what's something that you do that's not writing?
I do. I made up a little song when this LGBTQ organization got nervous about having me, and I put a little thing on Instagram. I'll send it to you. I'm not great at banjo. I'm perfectly fine. I'm only good at writing. I'm a perfectly average banjo player.
that they need to read the Tomboy book.